Dell Prosser put his hand flat on the top of the jaw and left it there while the auctioneer tried to move the sale along without him. That is not a thing bidders do. You look at a lot, you decide. You raise a finger, or you do not. You do not walk into the middle of the row, lay your palm down on a cold iron casting the size of a kitchen range, and stand there with your hat pushed back while 200 people wait for you to be finished. The auctioneer waited about 8 seconds. Then he said, "Well, sir, it is not going anywhere." And the crowd laughed, and that was the first laugh of the afternoon at Dell Prosser's expense. It would not be the last one that day. It would be the last one that mattered. The lot was a bench vise. I want you to sit with that word for a second, because the whole of this story lives inside it. A vise is the thing bolted to the corner of your workbench. It weighs 40 pounds. You crank it shut on a length of pipe with one hand while you hold a hacksaw in the other. Every man at that sale had one. Most of them had bought theirs used for less than the price of a tank of fuel, and had never once thought about it again. This one weighed 10,400 pounds. 5 tons of cast iron and forged steel sitting on a timber and plate base in the weeds at the end of the machinery row at a consignment sale outside Bellefontaine, Ohio. The jaws stood open about a foot. The screw across the front was square thread, as thick through as a man's wrist, and the operating handle had a bend in it from something that happened long before anybody at that sale was born. Somebody had chalked a 4-figure number on the side of the base plate, and the chalk had survived under a lip of iron where the rain could not reach it. The catalog gave it 6 words. Large bench vise, cast, sold where is. Nobody bid. That is not an exaggeration, and it is not a figure of speech. The auctioneer opened it at $200 and came down, and came down, and came down, and the crowd enjoyed every step of the descent the way crowds do. And at $40, Dell Prosser raised one finger without taking his other hand off the jaw, and Arla Quimby wrote it in the book, and it was over. Von Teal, who buys scrap out of Lima by the ton and does not pretend otherwise, told him he had just paid $40 for $780 worth of iron and a very expensive problem in getting it home. He was not being cruel. By his arithmetic he was being generous, and by his arithmetic he was right. The problem in getting it home was real. 5 tons does not go on a trailer because you would like it to. It took a borrowed skid loader, 4 hours, 2 lengths of oak cribbing, and a man from the yard who kept saying he did not want to be responsible for this. When it was finally down and chained, in the rain, Dell Prosser put his hand flat on the top of the jaw again and left it there. And the man from the yard asked him what he kept doing that for, and got no answer at all. If you've made it this far into Dell Prosser's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Here is what nobody in that crowd knew, and here is what Dell Prosser did not know either, not yet, not with any certainty. He knew what it was. That is a different thing from knowing what it was for. What it was a boiler shop vise, not a bench tool made large, a different animal entirely, built for a trade that has almost stopped existing. When shipyards and boiler works had to hold a piece of heavy round stock steady while men worked it by hand, they did not clamp it in something that weighed 40 pounds. They clamped it in something that weighed more than the work did. Bolted through a floor that had been poured for the purpose, because the whole point of a holding fixture is that it does not move when everything else does. The casting carried a maker's name and a serial number, both still legible under the rust. It was made in 1907. And here is why nobody in that field wanted it, which is a more interesting question than it looks. It is not that they did not know what it was. Half those men had worked in shops. It is that a tool like this has almost nowhere left to go. It is too heavy for a hobbyist and too old for a production shop. It cannot be bolted to a normal floor, because a normal floor will crack under it the first time you put a 6-foot cheater bar on the handle. It cannot be resold easily, because the freight costs more than the tool. And it does one specific thing superbly for a trade that mostly stopped. Between about 1950 and about 1990, most of these went for scrap in a quiet, unremarkable way. Not because anybody decided to destroy them, because a shop closed and a building was cleared, and the cheapest thing to do with 5 tons of iron bolted to a floor is to cut it where it stands and weigh it in. Nobody photographed it. Nobody wrote it down. It is one of the largest uncatalogued disappearances of industrial capability in the country, and it happened one building at a time, on Tuesdays for 40 years. So when Volunteer looked at that lot and saw $780 of iron, he was not being ignorant. He was applying the exact logic that had already removed almost every other one of these from the world. Now here is where it stops being an interesting piece of iron and starts being a story. About 1,000 miles away, on the eastern shore of Nova Scotia, a marine repair works had been sitting on a problem for most of a year. The yard's name does not matter. What matters is the work. There is a fleet of steel draggers out of that coast, boats in the 70 to 90-foot range. And the ones built in a particular stretch of years all share a rudder stock of a particular diameter, a solid steel post, oversized for the hull, because the yard that built them believed in overbuilding and had the stock on hand. Those posts wear. When they wear past a limit, they must be trued and reworked, and when they are reworked, the work has to be signed off by a marine surveyor before the boat can carry insurance, and without insurance, the boat does not fish. Senate Rude was the superintendent there. He had 11 of those shafts sitting on trestles in his shop. 11 boats, 11 crews, every one of them tied to a wharf. The trouble was not skill, and it was not steel. The trouble was that the last fixture on that coast, rated to hold a post of that diameter, had been cut up in 2017 when the shop that owned it closed and the building was cleared. Everything after that was too small, too light, or bolted to a floor that would not take the load. A modern setup, a new fixture, a new floor, the engineering to certify both had been quoted at $1.9 million and 11 months. And the fishing season does not wait 11 months for anybody. It is worth being precise about what a tied-up boat costs, because otherwise the numbers later on sound invented. A dragger of that size fishing its licenses is not a small business. Between the crew shares, the vessel's own earnings, and the shore work that depends on the landings, a boat sitting still through a season is a hole that runs into 6 figures before anybody has done anything wrong. Multiply that by 11. Then add the part that does not appear on any ledger, which is that crews do not sit and wait. They go and get other berths in other ports, and some of them do not come back, and a fleet that loses its people does not simply switch itself on again the following spring. So Senate Rude was not solving an engineering problem. He was watching a clock. And the 4 things a marine surveyor wants before he signs are not negotiable, which is why the clock mattered so much. He wants a fixture with a known rating from a known maker with the paperwork to prove both. He wants that fixture anchored to a floor engineered to take the load with the engineering signed. He wants a witness load test at or above the working figure. And he wants all three of those things to still be true on the day the work is done, not on the day somebody made a promise about them. Miss any one of the four and the boat does not carry insurance, and a boat that does not carry insurance does not fish, however good the repair actually is. Rude had been calling around North America for most of a year, asking a question that got shorter every time he asked it. Do you have one? Nobody had one. Then somebody sent him a photograph from an Ohio consignment sale of a lean man in overalls with his hand flat on top of an enormous open jaw. The call came on a Tuesday evening. Dell Prosser listened to the whole thing without saying much, which Rude later admitted he found unnerving, and then asked one question. He asked what the shafts measured. Rude told him. There was a long pause on the line, and then Dell Prosser said, "I will call you back Thursday," and hung up. He did not call back on Thursday because he was pleased. He called back on Thursday because he had spent 2 days with a straightedge and a set of feeler gauges finding out whether the thing in his yard could actually do what the photograph implied it could do. That is the difference between a man who buys iron and a man who buys tools. The photograph is not the tool. He was working through 3 questions, and he wrote them on the back of the sale bill in pencil, and I want to give them to you now because the rest of this story is the answering of them, one at a time, out of order, over 3 months. The first was whether the jaws would actually open far enough and stay parallel when they did. A vise that closes true when empty and goes out of parallel under load is not a fixture. It is a decoration. The second was whether the casting had ever been cracked and repaired. A century-old iron casting that has been welded is a different object from one that has not, and no surveyor alive will sign against one. The third was the one he did not know how to answer at all, and it was simply, why is this here? Why is a tool this good sitting in a field in Ohio with no bidders? Things of real value do end up in strange places, but not usually for no reason, and a man who cannot explain why something is cheap has not finished checking it. He answered the first question that Thursday with a dial indicator and a length of ground bar, and the answer was yes, within 4 thousandths across the full opening, which is better than it had any right to be. The other 2 took considerably longer. The price they arrived at was $96,000 plus rigging and freight, with the yard taking possession after a witnessed load test. And that is where a shorter story would end, with a man buying something for $40 and selling the use of it for $96,000, and everybody at the sale looking foolish. That is not what happened. Because before the load test, somebody did their homework. A surveyor is not being difficult when he asks for provenance. He is being a surveyor. Before he signs his name to 11 rudder stocks and 11 insurance certificates, he wants to know what the fixture is, where it came from, and whether the maker built it to the drawing. So a researcher was engaged, quite properly, and she went looking for the works records of a company that stopped existing in 1961. She found them. That is the part nobody expected. A county historical collection in Ohio had the whole run of works ledgers, water-stained but complete, donated by the family of a foreman in the 1970s and read by almost nobody since. She found the serial number, and the entry against it in a clerk's hand in ink in 1907 read rejected at test. Not shipped. Sit with that for a moment because it is worse than it sounds. It does not say damaged. It does not say sold as seconds. It says the maker built this vise, put it on the test floor, failed it, and wrote it off. On paper, this object never left the works. On paper, it is not a finished tool at all. It is an error that somehow walked out of a factory 119 years ago and has been pretending ever since. The surveyor read the entry and said what any surveyor would say. He said he could not certify work performed in a fixture that its own manufacturer had rejected, and that he was sorry, and that this was not a matter of opinion. Senate Rude called Ohio and said the words that end most stories like this one. He said, "We have to step back from it." Now, what would you have done? Because here is the thing about that moment. Dell Prosser was, right then, holding an object that a scrap dealer had valued at $780 and a shipyard had valued at $96,000, and the difference between those two numbers had just been erased by 4 words in a ledger. And he had an offer. Vaughn Teal, who had been following this from Lima with the amused patience of a man waiting to be proved right, had raised his number considerably once he understood what the casting actually was. There was a market for iron of that age and that grade, and there was a firm prepared to pay $140,000 for it, on the condition that it be broken up on site. $140,000 for something he had bought for $40, with no test, no surveyor, no freight to Nova Scotia, and no argument. All he had to do was let them cut it. He asked for 3 weeks. What he did with those 3 weeks is the reason I wanted to tell you this. He went and found Hollis Bray. Bray was 67, retired, living about 90 minutes away, and he had spent 22 years in a boiler shop that ran Vises out of that same works. He was, as far as anybody could establish, the last man alive who had worked the pattern. Dell Prosser drove him out to the yard and did not explain anything. He just walked him up to it. On the drive out, Bray answered the second of the 3 questions without being asked, because Dell Prosser described the casting to him, and Bray said flatly that the works had never welded a repair into a Vise body in his time, and would not have in 1907 either. They broke them up, because a welded holding fixture is a liability, and everybody in the trade knew it. He said you could confirm it in 10 minutes with a magnet and a bottle of dye penetrant, and they did that afternoon, and there was nothing there. Then they got to the yard, and Hollis Bray put his hand flat on the top of the jaw and left it there. Then he said, "This one has been worked," which meant nothing to anybody until he explained it, and what he explained was this: a casting that has only ever been cast has one kind of surface. A casting that has been worked, scraped, fitted, adjusted by hand on a bench by somebody with a straight edge has another. You cannot photograph the difference. You can feel it with the flat of your hand, because hand scraping leaves a pattern of shallow bearing points that your palm reads as a faint regular texture, where a raw casting reads as dead smooth. Nobody hand scrapes a vise they have rejected. You do not spend 40 hours of a skilled man's time fitting a tool you are about to write off. So the 2 of them went back to the ledger, and this time they read the whole page instead of the 1 line, and the whole page said something the 1 line did not. The order above it, entered 6 weeks earlier, was a special. A customer had ordered 4 vises with the jaw depth increased 3/8 of an inch over the standard drawing to hold oversized stock. Underneath that order, in the same hand, canceled, customer in receivership. 4 vises built 3/8 of an inch over the drawing for a customer who went under before he could take delivery. And when a works in 1907 has 4 finished tools that do not match its own catalog drawing and no customer to send them to, it does not scrap them. It marks them rejected at test, because that is the ledger category that lets a foreman clear a finished job off the books without anybody being blamed for the loss. Then, being a works full of practical men, it quietly lets them go out the back gate, one at a time, over years, to whoever needed one. The Vise had not failed a test. It had failed to have a customer. And the 3/8 of an inch, the exact deviation that got it written off, was the only reason on God's earth that it could hold a rudder stock that every other fixture on the eastern seaboard was too shallow to take. The thing that disqualified it was the thing that made it the only one that fit. And that answered the third question, the one Dell Prosser had not known how to ask properly. Why was it in a field with no bidders? Not because it was worn out, and not because it was broken, and not because anybody had ever tested it and found it wanting. It was cheap because of a bookkeeping decision made by a foreman in 1907 who needed a finished job off his books and reached for the tidiest line available, and because 119 years later, that line was the first thing anybody read about it. An object had been carrying a bad word around for longer than anyone had been alive, and not one person in that time had gone and read the sentence it came from. The load test took place on a Thursday in the yard outside Bellefontaine, with the surveyor present, Senate Rude having flown down, Hollis Bray sitting on an upturned crate, and Vaughn Teal standing at the fence with his arms folded because he had asked to watch, and Dell Prosser had said he could. They loaded it in stages, which is the only way it is ever done. You do not simply put the full figure on a 119-year-old casting and hope. You go up in steps, and between every step a man with a dial indicator checks whether anything has moved that should not have. And a man with a bright light and a magnifier goes over the areas where a casting of that shape would fail first if it were going to. It took most of the morning, and it was, by every account, extremely boring, which is exactly what you want. The interesting load tests are the ones that go wrong. At every step, the jaws stayed parallel. At every step, the base plate stayed flat to the pad. Nothing opened up, nothing sang, nothing shifted. And at the top of the range, when they read the gauge, Hollis Bray started laughing. And when they asked him what was funny, he pointed at the base plate, at that 4-figure chalk number that had been sitting under a lip of iron since before either of his parents were born. It was not a price. It had never been a price. It was the test load, in pounds. Written on the casting by the man who tested it in 1907, the way you write a result down before you forget it. The Vise held to its chalk mark and passed it. The surveyor signed. The fixture went to Nova Scotia on a lowboy, then on a barge. It was bolted to a floor that had to be cut out and re-poured to take it, which cost the yard another $31,000, and which they paid without argument, because the alternative was $1.9 million and most of a year. The 11 shafts were trued and reworked and signed off across the following 9 weeks. 11 boats went back to sea. That is somewhere around 60 men who fished that season instead of not fishing it. And the part that surprised everybody, including Dell Prosser, was what happened after. Because a yard that has the only rated fixture of its kind on a coast does not just fix its own 11 shafts. Work comes to it. Within 14 months, the Marine Works had reopened a bay that had been closed since 2017, put 2 men back on heavy holding work, and signed a 4-year agreement with the Provincial Apprenticeship Board to qualify heavy fitting apprentices on that floor, because you cannot certify a man on a machine you do not have, and they had the only one. That is the part that is easy to miss. The $96,000 was the smallest thing that happened. The Vise did not just do a job, it gave a trade somewhere to be taught. Dell Prosser turned down the $140,000. He has said, when asked, that it was not a hard decision and that people keep expecting it to have been. His reasoning was arithmetic, which is what his reasoning usually is. The $140,000 was the last money that object would ever earn. The $96,000 was not. Von Teal, to his credit, has never pretended he was right. He tells the story himself now, at sales, and he tells it accurately, which is more than most men would do. There is a photograph from the day the fixture was commissioned in Nova Scotia. It is not a good photograph. Somebody took it on a phone in bad light in a shop with the doors open onto gray water. In it, a lean man in his 60s in denim overalls is standing beside a rudder stock 1 foot thick and 14 feet long held dead steady in a pair of jaws made 3/8 of an inch too deep, in a works that wrote it off 119 years ago as a thing that had failed. He is not looking at the camera. He is not looking at the shaft either. He has his hand flat on the top of the jaw, palm down, the way you would rest a hand on a horse's neck, and he has left it there.